a panel next to talk to you. The moderator is Carol Westlake. She's the Executive Director of the Tennessee Disability Coalition, and she's going to introduce the panel, and I think you'll enjoy the next hour and a half. Be prepared with questions.
Yes. Hi, delighted to be here. I'm Carol Westlake. I am from Tennessee. I work with a disability organization there. And with me today is Amanda Beals from Paraquad, which is a disability organization in Missouri, and Melanie Bull, who is my colleague in Tennessee. And we are part of the RAAV team, however we all say that. And our piece was working with the assistive technology folks and some of the other people on sort of the disability side of this project. And really, what we were really the most interested in was sort of the voter experience of people with disabilities, taking a look at what it's like on the ground in polling places, and so taking a look at poll workers, and the way folks get trained, the way folks interact with people with disabilities, and how people with disabilities can vote more accessibly. I think, when Doug talked this morning about the fact that this is a growing need in elections to make sure that we are accommodating people with all kinds of disabilities. Some of the data says that, by 2040, we're going to more than 40% or almost 50% of folks are going to have disabilities of some variety. And you have heard, I think this morning, about the range of those disabilities and some of the challenges that you all face and the people with disabilities face in terms of trying to be as participatory in elections as they possibly can be. So that was really sort of what we tried to focus on when we were doing things. Not only is our research not peer reviewed either, Diane, but it was really very applied. We tried to work directly with folks with disabilities and directly with poll workers to kind of try to see what worked. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that this afternoon. We really appreciate an interactive format. We know that you just had lunch. We know it's hard to stay awake. So please participate, and I'm sure that Ernie will be happy to help run a microphone around if we need to, or we can always repeat questions or comments if we need to do that as well. So I'm going to, Mandy, let you introduce yourself and Paraquad just a little bit, and Melanie, I'll let you talk about the coalition, and then we'll get into what we did.
All right. Thank you. I'm Amanda Beals. I'm the Civic Engagement Organizer at Paraquad, and Paraquad is a Center for Independent Living. And if you're not familiar with that, every state has a Center for Independent Living. They're developed under federal law, so whatever state you're from, you have one that works for you. And our mission is really to promote independence through choice and opportunity, and we have the vision that people with disabilities will have full and equal access in their communities. And so what better way to promote that than by making sure that people with disabilities have the option to vote in a private and independent way, because it really is the right that promises all of our other rights in the community that we need. So Paraquad's been working on voting for over 10 years, and some examples of things we do are get out the vote with the disability community, voter education, and candidate work. We offer assistance to our local election authorities and also have surveyed polling places for them and made suggestions for them. So that's a little bit about Paraquad.
Hi everyone, I'm Melanie Bull. I'm the Public Policy Director with the Tennessee Disability Coalition in Nashville, Tennessee. The coalition was started as an alliance of organizations and individuals that's cross-disability, cross-age, working together to promote the full and equal participation of all people with disabilities. We're a public policy outfit. That's how we started, and that's why we started. So we work together to advocate for broad public policy that ensures independence, accessibility, empowerment, and inclusion for people with disabilities.
Right. And so it was in that context that we started talking about taking a look at polling places, poll workers. We had all done surveys over time. We all really got involved in voting sort of pre-2000, pre-HAVA even, just to understanding that for people to fully participate in society, that voting was a fundamental right to that. So that's really kind of where we got started. So we were really interested when we began taking a look at this project and looking at the Rutgers study that Doug talked about this morning, and really wanted to know if people with disabilities that we knew were having those same kinds of experiences. So we did not do an oversampled randomized study. What we really did to start out on this project was go to our own lists of people with disabilities, people who had found their way to either the Center for Independent Living at Paraquad in Missouri or to the Disability Coalition, who were actively involved in some way in that community. And that was really sort of the beginning of our work, and talking a little bit about sort of voter experience and what we needed to know from them in order to begin to take a look at polling. So I'll let you get started.
Yeah, so to talk a little bit about our phone survey, we administered phone surveys to about 1,200 voters with disabilities, broken up into 3 different groups: St. Louis City and St. Louis County, and then the greater Missouri area, and then the Tennessee area. Since that's where we're located, that's where we did our work. And so what we really wanted to do is just get an idea of what people were experiencing. So we asked them general questions about their election day experiences. How would you rate your voting experience? How helpful were the poll workers? Do you feel like they were knowledgeable about accessible voting equipment, about accommodations that are available? Was your polling place accessible? Just to get a general feel of the overall voting day. And so I'll talk a little bit about Missouri's results, and then Melanie's going to talk about Tennessee's. They were a little bit different. So in Missouri, our results largely mirrored the Rutgers survey. So people in Missouri overwhelmingly said that their poll workers were respectful, that they had a welcoming environment, that people weren't saying things to them that were offensive, and so that was great. And it was surprising to us because we had heard in the past that was a problem, and that did not appear to be a problem at all with our voters. So there were really 3 other things that we wanted to focus on, 3 problems that emerged from the survey. People overwhelmingly felt that poll workers weren't knowledgeable about the voting machine, or the voting machine wasn't working, or it wasn't set up in the area, so they didn't feel like their poll workers were knowledgeable. A lot of people expressed difficulties getting in and around their polling place due to accessibility issues. And finally, voters felt that poll workers weren't aware of or knowledgeable about the accommodations that are available to them. And then on the flip side of that, some voters weren't aware of accommodations that were available too, which can complicate things further. So for each of those questions, it was probably a little over half of the people we surveyed said that there was a problem with that, which is a pretty big number for us.
Yeah, in Tennessee, we had a very different experience. Our numbers and our results were overwhelmingly positive. The biggest problem that we had were access issues, just general polling place accessibility, not being able to get in and out or move around their polling place. But in terms of the voter experience and knowledgeable poll workers, when we asked about the overall voting experience, 97% of the folks from Tennessee said that they had a positive voting experience. And then when we asked about knowledgeable poll workers, 94% said that they felt that their poll workers were knowledgeable about accommodations and accessibility. And so that was extremely different than what we saw in Missouri, with over half expressing that they weren't.
Yeah. So after Melanie and I patted ourselves on the back and said, wow, what a great job we're doing in working with election officials and making everything fabulous, we really wanted to spend a little bit of time sort of drilling down on that and sort of trying to understand why the Rutgers study was a little bit different, why it sort of mirrored in Missouri, and why Tennessee, where we're usually last in everything, we were doing so very well. And so Melanie, I want you to talk a little bit about some of the things that, as we talked to folks around the country, we kind of got to that place.
We were definitely shocked by those results. We didn't expect things to be bad, but we didn't quite expect things to be so good. Being a disability advocate, you kind of hear the complaints. People don't really call you after they vote and say, hey, I had a really great time voting. Just wanted to let you know that it was good. We don't get those kinds of calls, unfortunately, and I'm sure you guys don't either. So we kind of took a step back, thought about what was different in Tennessee, what was different in Missouri. We were going around to these election center meetings, meeting administrators and folks like you from across the country who were doing different things. And we kind of realized that Tennessee, amazingly being the last in everything, has done a really good job of being forward-thinking since HAVA was implemented. One thing about Tennessee that's different from a lot of other states we found is that we're an all voting machine state. We're entirely paperless, aside from an absentee ballot, but there are a lot of hurdles to get an absentee ballot in Tennessee. You have to have a doctor's note saying that you have a permanent disability. So it's really difficult to get on the permanent absentee ballot. We also have our state protection and advocacy agency, the Disability Law and Advocacy Center of Tennessee, created a poll worker guide 10 years ago that is now being used in all 95 counties in Tennessee, that is a part of their training all across the state. And it's been used statewide for at least the last 5. So these poll workers and these election administrators are pretty well versed in the needs of people with disabilities. The coalition also in-house created a disability etiquette guide, which is on the back table for any of you guys that might want it, that is also used now in all 95 counties of the state as part of training for poll workers each election cycle. We also have a state-appointed HAVA person who only works on HAVA, who was hired right after the passage. So I think those are some things that are a little bit different. We also have a really long early voting period. You know, that was one of the suggestions that Diane made. We have a 2-week voting period that we're actually looking at extending into 3. It averages usually it's usually more than 14 days. It usually averages between 16 and 17 days. So that makes a huge difference. We're not experiencing long lines. Most people early vote. About 60% of our voters early vote. And any election administrator would anecdotally tell you that all of their voters with disabilities early vote. So they're getting a little more one-on-one attention. They're not having to wait in lines. They don't feel the pressure of being rushed. So I think that makes a huge difference in our state.
Yeah, I think it really does. And so that was really, as we looked at some of the suggestions about making sure that all the machines are set up, as Doug said. Well, they're all set up if everybody's voting on the same machine. If poll workers are really familiar with the machines because everybody's voting on the same machine. And so it kind of matches that dream, Diane, that we all thought we were heading to in HAVA. And although there is a movement in our state to go back to paper ballots, of doing a voter verified paper ballot, so that's, but at this point, that is still the same. All the machines are the same, excuse me. So those were really interesting things. Then as we looked at Missouri and at Tennessee, the demographics are really about the same. We're sort of states in the middle of the country, about the same size, about the other kinds of demographics are the same. And so we really thought that those are some of the things that really helped lead us to take our next steps, which was to take a look at poll worker training and that sort of thing. So Melanie, I'll let you kind of talk about, because we had this training in place in Tennessee, what you all did in Missouri.
Yeah, and so our goal was to develop poll worker trainings to kind of make those results better. And so the next thing we did, since we know disability, but I'm not an election administrator and I didn't know much about that. So we really wanted to get the administrator's point of view. And so we set up meetings with our county clerks and our administrators in Missouri to figure out what's going on and what some of you guys' needs are. So some of the observations that we made, and we met with people all across Missouri, some of the observations we made is that PowerPoint and lecture is really the most widely used training methodology among people. There were a few jurisdictions that used like a really unique hands-on, interactive, no PowerPoint thing, but that wasn't the norm, and that was mostly the really small jurisdictions that didn't have that many poll workers. And it makes a lot of sense because it's an easy way to get a large number of people with a lot of information in a short amount of time. How are you going to do that? A PowerPoint and lecture. So poll worker trainings on average were between an hour and a half and 2 hours long. If you suggest going longer, there was a lot of pushback to that. So the average was an hour and a half to 2 hours. And the reasons, again, make sense. You have to keep it short for funding. You need to keep people's attention. I know there's a lot of people who feel that most poll workers are older, but you still have poll workers who are working, the 40-hour work week. So you want to be respectful of their time. Evaluation was not a popular subject. Reasons ranging from people didn't want their poll workers to feel intimidated to people didn't really want to hear what the poll workers had to say about their training style, and so they had their own personal reasons for not doing it. And so that actually got in the way of us working with some people, because if you're going to do a pilot, you need to be able to evaluate the materials you're using and If you can't evaluate, then how do you know if you're being effective? And then the other thing that we observed is that a lot of people really wanted to get new equipment. They wanted to try new things. They wanted to expand what they were doing, but they felt like they didn't really have the money to do that, that they are kind of strapped for resources, and so you're kind of stuck with what you've got right now. And so that was also an observation. And then on the other side of that, asking people what your needs are, what you want to see from our relationship. And the number one people said is that retention of information is actually a much bigger problem than training poll workers, because they said we can train them whatever style you put out, we can give them all the right information, we can tell them all the right things to do, but when they get there on election day, we're not there, and they're going to make the decision that they think is right regardless of what we tell them to do. So there's a huge problem that a lot of people express frustration at. So the other thing is that we were trying to do an interactive training. We're trying to get people to implement that, and the idea was well received, but it's hard to implement, especially in larger jurisdictions where you have lots of poll workers and limited resources. It's just not as realistic, and so that is another need is training that people could implement in their jurisdictions. Checklists and visual aids are something that people said would be helpful, so we looked at that when we were developing our training. And then a lot of people said that they want more poll workers, that if they could get more poll workers, especially younger, tech-savvy poll workers to help with the machines, that would solve a lot of problems too, which just to go off of that, I understand where that would be coming from. But when I was younger than I am now, I was a poll worker in Nebraska, and I sat through a 4-hour PowerPoint training, and when I got to my polling place, I didn't even know there was a voting machine. So then I was younger, so it was actually the older guy that took charge of that and did all that. So I get the sentiment, but it's like Diane was saying, they're not necessarily intuitive, to people. So. And then the final thing that people wanted was more accessible signage and where to place signage.
Good. So does that make sense to you all? Does that describe poll worker training that is similar to what you all do? Okay. It's the post-lunch crowd. Good. So we really, as we have done this work, just discovered that, all elections really are local when it comes right down to it, and people's experiences are very, very different. I will tell you that we had a very interesting experience last week, a week and a half ago in Seattle. As Doug said, the states that were represented at the Seattle training were almost all mail-in states. And so talking about poll worker training was a little bit challenging because they don't do a lot of that. But really, we were able to talk about sort of what it's like to interact with people with disabilities, because there are a variety of ways you do that, obviously, as election officials, and sort of those issues around where people go and how you make those things the most accessible were really important. Well, we had diverged a little bit in our work because of the differences in our two states. And so one of the things that we wanted to do after having in Tennessee surveyed people who are on our database of voters that we keep of voters with disabilities was to also sort of take a look, overwhelmingly positive, and those were active folks, but to take a look in polling places and say what really is going on for people who don't find their way to a disability group, for example. So Melanie, if you want to talk a little bit about our poll watching, that would be good.
Absolutely. So we we didn't do kind of formalized interviews with our election administrators, but we had been talking to enough of them throughout the course of this project to know that they were having the same needs and we were having the same observations as Missouri was with their election administrators. The biggest thing that an election administrator would talk to me about was not having enough training time. The second thing was always the retention of information from the poll workers. If you're a huge county or a huge election jurisdiction, like Nashville is a pretty big city, we hire about 1,600 poll workers every election cycle. We need more like 2,400, but I think some people are scoffing at me at the size of my big city.
Okay, for us it's big.
It's big. It's big in the South. So that's a lot of poll workers that they're trying to train at one time. They obviously have to start training them a month or two before Election Day. If you're in that first cycle of poll workers and you're getting trained at the beginning at the end of September and then election day is November 5th, you're obviously going to forget some of the things you learned, especially if it was on a PowerPoint and you kind of zone out after 1 hour and then you don't remember what really happened in the second hour, and maybe that was the part about accessibility in the second hour, and then you just kind of forget because you don't have anything that you can take home with you. So we wanted to look inside the polling places and see what was going on. You know, we had these overwhelmingly positive results, but then we talked to election administrators who seemed really frustrated about the fact that they weren't able to adequately train their poll workers, or not adequately train their poll workers, but there's always that nervous energy after you train a poll worker and then between what happens during the training and what happens on election day. So we actually partnered with a few groups that are members of the coalition and trained some poll watchers that were all people with disabilities, so they would be able to kind of see from their perspective, from the perspective of a person with a disability, what was happening in the polling place. And if things were great, if things were average, or if things were awful. And again, we heard really positive results from our poll watchers. They did not see many people with disabilities. That doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of people with disabilities in the polling place. Again, you can't always see that. But from their perspective, they thought that poll workers were really friendly. When someone did ask for an accommodation, maybe it wasn't, you know, what we would want in an ideal world, and step by step, this is what should happen and how you should deal with it. But poll workers wanted to help. They wanted to be helpful, they were friendly, and they figured things out just by being able to adequately communicate with the person that needed an accommodation. Again, the biggest problems that we had were access. You know, it's just, we can't make all of our polling places fully accessible, and that is really unfortunate, but we have a really large rural population in Tennessee and very limited in the polling places that they can choose. So when we're going into those more rural areas, we're finding a lot of our polling places we have real access problems. And we don't have curbside voting like they have in Missouri, so we don't have that option. But
Okay. So, Mandy, so you, after talking to county clerks and doing a variety of things, decided to try to develop some curriculum and training that might work for poll workers. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so our goal, using what we learned talking to clerks and talking to voters, we set out to develop this curriculum that we thought would kind of bridge those gaps. And so before we did that, we looked into what are best practices in training adults. A lot of people said our poll workers are older, and so we want to do training that can really work for them. And so some of the best practices that we found, I can just get this back, found that we put into our training is to use mixed methods. So adults learn in different ways, so presenting materials in different ways is really necessary if you're going to do a training. And so what this says is the same method should not be used for a long period of time when you're training adults. So bottom line, if you want your training to be successful, then you can't just rely on that PowerPoint, even though it might be more convenient for you. Adults also learn by participating. We have to be involved and engaged in our learning process, especially for topics that involve a lot of processes or complex information, which makes me think of voting machines, you know, and voting technology. So we need to be able to try on those tasks if we're really going to get it. So if you want your poll workers to be able to perform those tasks in their job on election day, you have to give them hands-on experience before election day. Handouts are effective, but when they're paired with other methods of training. And so what I think of when I saw this best practice is when I sit in an exit row on an airplane, which I've only had to do once, but they tell you, they have the pictures on the side of the window saying this is what you do if, hopefully there's not an accident, but my picture had just pictures and no words, and so there's a handout and no one explained it to me, so I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, I hope nothing happens because I don't know what this picture is telling me, right? But if it was paired with instructions, it's like, oh yeah, I get that. And then finally, adults learn best when information is repeated and reinforced. So if you want your workers to remember what they're supposed to do, you have to have a plan for repetition or follow-up with them. And so what this really said to me, especially about the clerks that I was working with in Missouri, is that the traditional PowerPoint lecture does not follow best practices. It doesn't set your workers up to be successful on election day. And so we need to figure out a way to make these best practices work for what administrators, the resources administrators have. So do you want me to talk about? Okay. So we developed two materials really, and so the first one was, and this is on the back, and I have copies of this, but only enough for people to look through, and I'm more than happy to send electronic copies to people. They're just a little more expensive to print out for everyone at every conference. So it's a comprehensive curriculum, and it's supposed to be used as a pre-election training. And what we did is we followed the PowerPoint that was already being used by one of our administrators, because if people are going to use a PowerPoint, then we at least want it to say, you know, the information that we think is helpful too. So we just added things here and there, and if you look through here, you'll see the PowerPoint. The pages we added have notes at the bottom saying, say these things when you train on this slide. So like, you don't have to be an expert. We'll put the words in your mouth and you just have to say it that way. And so along with the PowerPoint, you'll see in the back there's tabs for lesson plans for each of the categories that we wanted to address, from accommodations to voting machines to accessible polling places. And each of the lesson plans has a variety of hands-on participatory exercises that trainers could choose from based on their training style and training needs. So you might have this amount of time to do this, and someone might have more time and want to spend more time on another thing. So they could really choose how they wanted their training to look. And then finally, there's checklists and handouts in here that can be used to reinforce that information. And this, while people like the idea of this, I have to say that in practicality, it was not well received by administrators. Most of them, the big thing was training time constraints again, which we talked about a little bit ago. But they even said, even if we just add that information that you want to our PowerPoint, we're already over our training time, let alone trying to add in one hands-on activity, you know, and so that kind of got in the way of us being able to use this curriculum. We had clerks who had confusion with ADA guidelines, so if we suggest you should tell your poll, and we only focused on, these are things that we think a poll worker would actually have control over, because a lot of those things poll workers don't, and even then we got pushback saying, well, why do we have to do this? Why should we have to tell them this? And so if you're in charge, or you have staff in charge of training that don't get ADA guidelines for polling places, your poll workers aren't going to be able to understand it either. And so that was a huge barrier. And then finally, financial restraints. So you would have to lengthen training times. They'd have to print off guides. If you lengthen training times after work, you have to give people food, or else they're there till 9 without eating, which is a problem if they've been at work all day. And so there were a lot of restraints to this. But then a lot of people really did like it and want to be able to implement it, though. So that was the first thing that we did. And then the second thing that we did was really to confront the information retention thing that everyone talked about. So St. Louis City, I'll hold it up so I don't get in the way of the microphone. Oh, thank you, Melanie. St. Louis City created an election day job aid, and so if you have the chance to look inside, it's step-by-step picture guide on how to carry out the processes of election day. And so they focused really on what administrators would want people to know. And so what we really liked about it is the picture with directions. So you can look at it, you can read it. It focuses on telling people step by step what to do. And it's big, so it's on 11 by 17 paper, so you don't have to look at small print. You can actually make the print a little bigger, which is good for your older poll workers who might not be able to see smaller print. And so that's what we liked about it. What we didn't like about it is it didn't really have that accessibility information. And so, of course, that's what we want to see in there. And so what we did is use St. Louis City's guide and created our own specifically on accessibility, just to test that idea out. And so it focused on how to set up, it has step-by-step pictures, how to set up an accessible polling place, how to use the accessibility features of a voting machine, how to use an audio ballot, and how to carry out one of the most misunderstood accommodations we have in Missouri, which is curbside voting. So kind of to help poll workers along with that. And again, like I said, it was developed to confront the need for repetition and retention. So if you have a voter who comes into your polling place and needs to use an audio ballot and they have a question and your poll worker doesn't know, they can just look in the guide and see, oh, this is how the audio ballot works, and offer that help to that person if they need it. And that was actually pretty well utilized. Of the poll workers who had the chance to use it, 50% of them did use it for a reason. And then of the people who used it, 90% said that they found it helpful for whatever question that they had. The most it was used for was voting machine use, how to use the voting machine, followed by polling place setup. So Yeah, and then the other thing I wanted to say about that, so it was helpful for poll workers, but we went to St. Louis City and actually took pictures of their equipment, and they had their absentee guy who was in charge of absentee voting come over and say, hey, can I actually see you taking pictures of the audio ballot, because I don't actually think I've ever used these features before, you know? And so it was helpful for even the staff. A lot of people who don't necessarily go over those features of the machine found this helpful for them.
Great, great. So Tennessee had a pretty good baseline of training that had been going on for a long time using a guide that has been around and was successfully used both at the annual election officials training in statewide as well as in local jurisdictions. And so we really wanted to continue to sort of confront this issue about the amount of time it takes to train and retention of training to continue to bolster the ability of poll workers to be able to particularly use the accessible voting machines. So Melanie, if you want to talk a little bit about what we did from that.
Yeah, so one of the pilots that we did, and again, we're not researchers, and as I talk about this pilot, you will realize how unresearchy that I am. So we still wanted to think about this idea of retention, this idea that these poll workers were forgetting things between their training and between election day, and to see what those things were and what was happening, and if we would be able to help with that at all. So like Carol said, we had some pretty good baselines, some materials that we knew were being used statewide. And then Mandy at Paraquad came up with the idea of these picture guides, and we loved that. We think that would be so helpful to poll workers and voters that are able to see this. And we wanted to do something that people could kind of take home a little easier and that we could distribute maybe a little more widely. So we made ours smaller, and they're on the back too. They're really similar to what we just showed you and what Mandy just showed you in her picture guides. And so we made them for all of the voting machines in the state using different access features and sent them out to our election administrators to distribute to the community, distribute to voters as they were coming in, to have in and around the polling place, on the tables, set up so that people could just flip through them during that time. But we also wanted to figure out if poll workers if they took them home, if they took these materials home, if they would use them, and if they were able to remember those problems or be able to effectively address these problems if they encounter on election day. So we decided to pilot in one county where Chattanooga, Tennessee is located. They were doing a municipal election. And it was, their mayoral race was going to be a blowout, so it was a very low voter turnout day. It also rained all day, very unfortunately. So we worked with the county election administrators, and we set up 2 test groups and 2 control groups. And they were for a polling place. So it was 2 polling places. Their poll workers were our test group, and then other 2 polling places, their poll workers were our control group. And so with the control group, they got the regular training that you would receive before any election day, and that's it. We did a baseline test with them to see what they knew, just about accessibility, about voters' rights, about the accessible machines, about any kind of disability law. And then the Hamilton County Election Commission also added in some of their own questions that they tested on, because we just passed a voter ID law and making sure that the poll workers knew about that. So they got that test, all 4 groups got that test right after they were trained by the Hamilton County Election Commission. Then the test group, what we did, we worked with them all for a month, and every single day I sent them via email some kind of tip sheet or video or something that they could be trained on that they would have at home with them, so they were getting every single day something that they could study. Unfortunately, we were not able to very accurately test that. Like I said, the election was extremely low turnout. In one of my polling places with my test group, they did not have a single voter all day.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was awesome.
Kind of skews your results.
very disappointing. But these test groups loved this idea. These poll workers want to be successful. You guys know this. You guys have really incredible people that want to work in elections, that want to participate in the democratic process, that feel very patriotic and very proud of their jobs, and they want to be able to help people vote. That's the goal that we all have at the end of the day, is making sure that everyone comes into our polling place can vote. So they did enjoy what we gave them. They felt it was helpful. They all felt that they were more knowledgeable about the process and would be able to tackle any kind of accommodations that were necessary. Unfortunately, they just weren't able to use it in that election. But we'll be following up with them on the next one and seeing if they remember any of the stuff that we taught them.
That's good, thank you. So suggestions for future work. What lessons learned from what you did? Mandy?
So the first thing that I'd want to talk about is we'd like you to consider basing your training on teaching workers how to use job aids and not necessarily on information memorization from a PowerPoint. We think that giving workers job aids and showing them how to utilize those aids on election day is really what sets workers up to be able to answer their own questions on election day at their polling place, which is what you want them to be able to do. And so the job aid, it proved to help with information retention because they had that information with them right there. It could lead to a better use of limited training time. So instead of focusing on a PowerPoint that takes up a lot of time, you could get people together in groups and give them the job aids that they're going to have at their polling place that day, teach them how to use it, and then give them those scenarios. Use the job aid to fulfill some of these tasks that you do as a poll worker. That follows best practices more than just the PowerPoint would do. So that's one of the things that came out of this as suggestions in focus groups and at other conferences, that might be a way to go if you're a lecture PowerPoint person. The other thing I want to talk about is we need to train our workers on how to use the accessible voting machines and not just set them up. Because if a voter has a question, it's not going to be about, of course, we want to make sure the machines are set up, don't get me wrong. They need to know how to do that. But if a voter comes in and has a question about the machine, about how to use the machine, about the voting process, your poll workers need to be able to answer those questions for voters about how the machine works. So when we had evaluated our poll workers, 10% of workers said that they were not comfortable setting up the voting machine, but 30% of them said that they weren't comfortable even using any of accessibility features or how to actually use the machine, which we thought was a huge difference. So focusing on both things and not just setting up the machine is something that we think people should consider as well. And then this was said before, but we'll say it again, and hopefully everyone remembers and retains this piece of information since it's been repeated. Work with community members and disability groups year-round on accessibility issues. All of the people who we worked with that were already doing great things had good relationships with their local disability organizations, and so they'd been able to work together. Every state has a Center for Independent Living, and your state might even have more than one. Every state has a protection and advocacy organization. Every state has a disability organization, so there's really no excuse not to be able to reach out to people. And with those, there's a packet, or there's a handout that talks about, suggestions for future use, and there's a link on there where you can go and find your local organizations. And then Diane had the book too, and I really encourage people to use those and reach out to people to build those relationships. A lot of times our St. Louis City has come to us even within the past month about a problem they're having with accessibility, and they just don't think that there's a way to fix it, and it's frustrating for them. And then we can offer them either an answer, or we can send them to someone who can give them an answer, and it's an easy answer that they never would have thought of, but since we're working in this every day, we know the answer to that. We worked with St. Louis County on their polling places, and they had a list of 10 that they said, these polling places can never be accessible. There's problems. Will you go out and look at them and offer suggestions? And some of them, they were right. There weren't any things that we could do to make that polling place accessible, but we could offer them advice on how to notify people ahead of time to let them know, this isn't accessible. Here are some other things you could do to promote curbside voting. And then there were at least half of the polling places where we just saw a simple fix 6 that you can put this in, and it's accessible. And so after that, those polling places were accessible, but they wouldn't have thought about that before. But having those relationships is really valuable.
I'm going to stop you for a minute. I think that's really, really true, and I think that's one of the messages that we really hope that we can give to you all. You know, it's funny, somebody was saying earlier that there was a election office that they weren't welcome in, a disability advocate, and that's rare, but it does happen on occasion. And I think that particularly around the beginning of HAVA and when people were really worried about things, there was a lot of sense. And somebody had the DOJ come in, I know, and they always win. And there's worry about doing that, about that. And I think that there has often been sort of a fear of the disability community that people are going to be sue happy, and that, you know, and that's really how we get things done. And it's not. You, as a friend of mine who is quadriplegic always says, you know, there are jerks with disabilities and jerks without disabilities. You know, nobody has a lock on any of that. And so to say that is never going to happen is certainly not true. At one of these meetings recently, somebody said to us that there was a fellow who wanted an audio ballot, and he wanted it in very specific ways. He didn't want an MP3, he wanted something else. And, you know, and you're going to occasionally find a person like that. But for the most part, if you really want to know how to accommodate somebody with a disability, you ask somebody with a disability or work with a group that does that, because they have been doing that their entire lives and have found mostly really inexpensive and practical ways to make things happen. And, you know, that relationship goes a really long way. You were talking a little bit about doing polling place accessibility surveys. Mm-hmm. Was that on a volunteer basis that you did it for folks? Did you do it in conjunction with your election officials?
So we had an advocacy, we have a self-advocacy group that went out and did that for the St. Louis County elections. We actually asked them if we could do it. They didn't come to us and ask us to do it because we get complaints from people about accessible polling places, so we wanted to be proactive that way. And lucky for us, you know, they wanted us to do that too, so it ended up being a great relationship. And I know that it can be a little contentious for some people working with disability organizations because of the litigation, threat, whatever. But if you don't work with us and we have issues that we can't address, then what other option do we have in order to get the accessibility and accommodations that our community needs? So all we want to do is be able to work together on those solutions and know that it's moving forward. So I think that relationships can be really good to bridge those problems.
Yes. Oh.
Well, I can speak. So I just want to be sure that I'm getting the whole realm of this. Mm-hmm. First of all, the problems that you all seem to be having, thank you, is with the structural availability. Is that correct?
In terms of access, that was regularly one of the most important issues that people brought up. Getting into and moving around the polling place, getting access to the machine.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the guidelines that we follow as far as the size of the doors, the ramps, and, you know, the curbs, the vented curbs and so forth. And this,
Yeah.
you're still having problems, in other words, with the structural availability for the handicapped.
Yes.
Okay.
Is that a fair?
Yeah, and
So
I think
they had problems getting the proper buildings for this?
well, so this is a problem in St. Louis, but it's a national problem that everyone experiences, a lack of accessible options for polling places. So one of the things we wanted to do with St. Louis County is one of their buildings had like 16 steps going down that you can't put a ramp, like that would be even more dangerous than the steps probably. And so we were like, we're gonna find them a better place because we're gonna take the time, we're gonna do it. And what was interesting for us is we couldn't. There wasn't another building in that jurisdiction that would have been accessible too. And so part of working together helps us understand, you know, the environment that both of us are working in. We see that sometimes that isn't an option. And so being able to, at least in the short term, work on a solution that's gonna be there for that election day. So for that particular polling place, we said, you're right, it's not accessible, there's nothing you can do to make it accessible. We tried to find another place and it doesn't exist. So at the very least then, this is what you can do. Make sure that people know about curbside voting as an accommodation. Make sure there's a sign out that says it. And I know that some people are like, well, we don't want to promote curbside for anyone to, but like if the person goes and sees those stairs and they can't get down the stairs, then what are they going to think? If they don't think there's another option, they're going to go away, they're not going to vote. And so we said at the very least, do this, share some options, and let people know about these other accommodations ahead of time, so they're not like worrying right when they get there.
Well, that was the biggest, when HAVA came in, that was the biggest thing we had to do. We had to change quite a few of our polling places because we are in the city. A lot of our buildings were not, weren't in code for handicapped access. And then it was funny because they turned around and attained that, changed their doorways and everything, and came back to us and asked, can we be polling places again? But,
That's
awesome. It's a shame because it is a small area where, where you zone for the polling and so forth. But I just wasn't quite clear, what do you do? We just will not use the building if it's not accessible.
Yeah.
We will find another building or do, reconstruction. Something has to be done to follow the law.
Yeah, that's
That's
great.
great.
Yeah, and Jim, did you have something?
Yeah, some innovative solutions that have come up. Some innovative solutions that have come up, particularly for rural areas, is use garages, sometimes in people's homes. In California, a lot of garages attached to people's houses are the polling places. The other idea is you've got fire departments. Move the trucks out and do the voting in the bay where the fire truck is. Some places that people have gone to with some success also include car dealers or farm heavy equipment, because very often they have an indoor showroom, and since they got to drive the car or the tractor in there, it doesn't work at every dealer, but it can work with some.
Thank you. Michelle?
Michelle Bishop, National Disability Rights Network. I've done this kind of work for a long time, and in my experience, even if you've got really great polling places, and even if you've got some pretty good accessible voting technology, it's only ever as good as the poll workers when it comes down to election day. I've talked to a lot of voters who will say, Michelle, you told me to try the new touchscreen machines and it was really cool, except I can't get my wheelchair under it or I couldn't reach it. And I'm going, well, I know that machine you voted on. It lowers and it tilts forward. They can pop the tablet out of the frame and put it on your lap. But the voter didn't know that, and the poll worker didn't know it either. And so then things kind of fall apart. And so that's why I get really excited about this kind of stuff, like the election day job aids or things like that, so that information is there and it's accessible to the poll workers. And I was wondering if that's been your experience as well in both states, and if that's kind of universally what seems to make the difference.
Yes, I think so. And I think, we can't say often enough that the data from the Rutgers study and the data from our own studies really showed that by and large people had really good experiences with respectful and helpful poll workers. Because I think that there is this sense that when people complain about elections that it somehow is the fault of poll workers. And it is true, Michelle, that poll workers didn't always know exactly how to do things. I think more in Missouri than in Tennessee, because the machine's pretty universal. So the poll workers are pretty comfortable with the machine, and you're just adding on that piece about lowering it or tilting it, but it's not from the very beginning. But even when they didn't have the perfect experience, the poll worker still made voting a decent experience. So we were really trying to sort of do that add-on, where you say, here's here's a short crib sheet, a tip sheet on how to make that thing work. And it really was, the poll workers reacted really well to sort of this like little daily tip that came in from Melanie as we were doing a month ahead of the election. It didn't take them long to read it. They could go watch the little YouTube video if they wanted to or didn't have to. But you know, it's one more little thing that clicks, and they might not remember exactly how to tilt the machine or lower it, but they remember it lowers, right? And that puts you another step closer, and that's really sort of what people's experiences were as we were doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that when I hear county clerks or administrators talking and they talk about training their poll workers, and everyone gets excited about etiquette and interacting with people with disabilities, or you know, bringing that piece in, and which I think is important. But you know, the research has shown that your poll workers are really, you know, respectful, and they get the etiquette, and so being able to focus on those hands-on things that poll workers need to know in order to make that experience accessible for voters, I think is what we were trying to put in with this training.
Yeah. Other thoughts? So other ideas about sort of implications for the future?
You know, the only other thing I wanted to say, and this is just because I got a lot of pushback from people about, you know, the information in the training about accessibility, our poll workers don't have control over that on election day, making the polling place accessible, and to an extent, like, that's exactly right. And so why put your poll work, that's why we think it's important to troubleshoot those accessibility issues well before election day, because if you shouldn't put your poll workers in a situation where people are going to be experiencing those accessibility issues and not have anything to do about it and not be able to, you know, fix that situation. So make sure that you at least know your polling place. And I know that the Presidential Commission came up with the idea of visiting your polling places ahead of time and making, you know, like drawing out the map of what each polling place are and seeing where those accessibility issues are and fixing it ahead of time, which I think is a great idea. So I just think that that's important, that you can't complain about your poll workers can't do this, but then also say, and we're also not going to do it. And so it just kind of creates a situation that can be not the best, I guess, for poll workers. Oh, and the other side of that then is a message we heard from the community, and we didn't test this, but it's something we wanted to test, and is to hire people with disabilities as poll workers and election staff. And so we had a lot of people, we did focus groups with our disability community after this, and that's what we heard over and over from people is, I tried to be a poll worker, I wanted to be a poll worker, I want to get in there and be involved in that, and I never heard back from our county clerks. And then the other side of that is people say, well, we need more poll workers. So we have, and if you know anything about the disability community, the employment rate is not good for a lot of people with disabilities. There's people who want that part-time kind of work. There's people who want to be able to, you know, make money and work. And so there's a large group of people that you can reach out to. And even places like Paraquat have employment programs where we train people to be effective in employment situations. And so being able to work with us in that, recruiting poll workers with disabilities who already know something about access, but not just poll workers, but people on your staff who can think through all of your processes, all of the things that you put out, and think from an accessibility perspective instead of having to come to us afterwards and, you know, have to rework it again. So we just encourage people to think about that when you're hiring workers.
Great. And Melanie, any other thoughts that you have on?
I mean, we definitely, as in terms of the future, we think that job aids are going to be really key when we continue to train our poll workers. And we know from our experience in Tennessee, and Mandy knows from her experience in Missouri, that these things are really well received, that poll workers want to be successful. And we can help them with that by giving them the tools on election day and not just the tools a month and a half beforehand. Again, I would encourage you to work with your advocacy groups to hire folks with disabilities. And we need to start thinking about this in the future. You know, Doug started this morning talking about how the majority, as the population ages, the majority of voters are going to have some type of disability. So we all need to be better about thinking about this together, to continue to work together to troubleshoot those problems that are going to happen in the future. And working with your local advocacy groups will make a huge difference in that. You know, when we watched the video that Tim showed us from the SABE election, the woman talking about, like, finally someone came to the person with the disability first instead of afterwards. And that perspective shift makes a huge difference, and I think that we'll all be able to troubleshoot a lot of our problems quicker if we work together better.
That's true. So one of the final things that we're in the process of doing in Tennessee, we have 5 different machines that are used in our 95 counties, and hopefully, they're wearing out, I'm afraid. As somebody mentioned earlier today, you know, we're going to have to be looking at other things. There is some move toward voter verified paper ballots, but while we've got these machines, the final thing that we're really trying to do as both an aid to people with disabilities and to poll workers is to do a series of very short videos, not just on setting up the machine, but using the accessibility features on the machine, so that as you saw in the Oklahoma video, somebody who's able to at least watch the video ahead of time and get encouraged to go out and do a demonstration and test that machine ahead of time is something that we want to be sure that people have available as well. A number of years ago, we had about 10 counties that set up local vote committees of people with disabilities and linked them to their election commission offices. And in one county, for example, that's a bedroom community for Nashville, they actually held an accessible voting day, a registration day, at the warehouse where they kept the machines. Pulled out a couple of machines, people with disabilities came, they had a little luncheon, they voted on the machines, registered people to vote, and it was a really positive experience for everybody and kind of demystified a little bit of the voting for those folks before they went in and voted on that DRE for the first time. So there are a whole variety of ideas and things that can happen when people work together to sort of tackle this one bite at a time, because it can be a very complicated issue, as you've heard today. So. Does anybody have any really good ideas that we haven't gotten to that? Oh, okay. You can ask a question too, but we're always looking for good ideas.
I think it was the really large mayor's election where no one showed up that you were talking about. I think if I heard right, you had some ongoing kind of poll worker training leading up to Election Day on a couple different focus groups.
Yes.
Could you talk about the method and the materials that?
Yes. The method, they were given in person. So I would go down there and I would meet with the groups that we were working with. And I will tell you this, we also paid these poll workers to participate in this month long because it is extra work. However, the poll workers at the end said they would all do it for free because it wasn't like homework, it was just like things that I was giving them every day and not, smacking their hand and checking back the next day and making sure that they read them. But we handed out our disability etiquette guide. We handed out our job aids that we use that are just like the picture guides that Missouri did. We handed them the poll worker training that the Disability Law and Advocacy Center had developed that I talked about at the beginning. And then every day I emailed them all something. And let me tell you, most of these poll workers were over 90. There were 8 of them in my test group. 3 of them had to get email addresses for me. But they all knew how to use a computer and understood email, but just didn't. Their wives had one, and so they didn't have anything separate. So they all got email addresses and were able to utilize that. They said that it was really easy for them. But of course, I sent them things in Word documents. I sent them links of videos. I sent them texts of the code, of the Tennessee code, with the voting laws. So it's just kind of a daily little snippet, of the millions of things that we get in our emails every single day that comes in. They just got an additional one from me every day. So it was 30 days of tips. Yeah. And unfortunately, they weren't able to use them, but they all did say that they learned a lot and could appreciate that, because, and I know that you guys as election administrators aren't always going to have the time to prepare that. You have a lot of things going on in the month leading up to an election day, especially if you have early voting. But I bet there are groups that would work with you on that, or that would give materials or links to videos or things that they have that you could at least hand the poll workers to take home with them, or maybe you could do a weekly email. I mean, we don't think that what we did was the most brilliant idea in the world, clearly. I mean, we picked a polling place with no voters. But we do think that it was extraordinarily helpful for the poll workers.
Yeah, Patrick.
One of the issues you had talked about how the DOJ had come to Franklin County. I think being in Ohio, and particularly Columbus, Ohio, Franklin County, very politically charged, especially presidential years. Everyone's watching us. So I think there was a lot of phone calls made, making sure everybody was able to vote. And what happens is there's only so many ways you can bring the DOJ into every state, and ADA, is one of them. So I think they came in. There was all kinds of talk about them coming in and making sure everybody was on notice, but they didn't come in till after, and it was like a real tiny off-year primary. And the reason I'm saying this is because I learned a big lesson from it. So not a lot of interest, not a lot of voters. We have a lot of temporary signage, and there is some mix-up over who's responsible to make sure that temporary signage gets put out. And so when they did check us, that was the main problem. Some of the signs didn't get put out. So what we learned between me and Steve, my folks being the logistics folks, and he had the PEOs, is we gave multiple. We put the responsibility on 3 different groups. The poll workers were to set it first thing up, and first thing they were supposed to put it up. Then our rovers, which each gets 5 locations, we have like 100 rovers, and then finally our crews. So all 3 of them now are responsible to make sure that the accessible signage is out. Because if it's not out, it doesn't do you any good.
Yeah.
So.
And signage is really important, and I think that you heard Doug talk about it a little bit this morning. Putting all those things up on the walls is only good if people have time and can read them, and the font is big enough, and they're not up too high for people in wheelchairs, and there's not a long line, and people are going to lose their place in line to read that stuff. So I think that some of those things probably need to be rethought. It doesn't do any good to have curbside voting if there's no sign at the 16 steps saying, honk your horn, or, call in and somebody will come out and do that. The signage really, really does make a difference. We had a polling place once, and the accessible entrance was not a main entrance, but there was accessible parking and a level entrance in the back, but there was no sign to tell you that that's where you needed to go. And so without arrows, without a way to do that, it didn't work. So signage is absolutely critical. And again, as Mandy said, it probably doesn't hurt to put out your signs and run some people with disabilities through it and see if they can figure out, where they need to go, what they need to do. And our little local vote committees would do that. Anytime they were asked to do it, just to be able to help out.
Yeah, the other stuff was, the actual handicap parking spot where if they don't have it striped properly, marked properly, we bring out temporary signs, set them up, and so some of those didn't get put out in time. So anyway, what I wanted to share is make sure you have multiple people responsible for getting stuff done. So.
And that's how it gets done.
We had that issue with St. Louis County too, when we were checking, their poll worker didn't have the signs out, and so we reminded them, and then we went the next election to do it again, and they had it up, and they said, we knew you were gonna come, so I wanted to make sure it's up for you, So I think having that person to go do that check is definitely a good idea.
Yeah.
I was actually just going to comment on that, is how do you then track? How do you track the issues that you've had to make sure that they don't happen again? Are there checklists created? Do you? Training. Just training and.
Sharing with them.
And the rovers, our rovers check to make sure everything's done.
So you create checklists to say, check on these items and.
And then we make a note of the precincts that aren't abiding.
Yeah.
And we talk to them.
Talk to them, right?
Since we're the queens of job aids, taking photographs. Everybody's got a cell phone now, right? Putting up the signage. If the signage is right in an election at a precinct. I mean, how about snapping photographs and saying match to sample? You know, but when you go back, make sure it looks like this next time, kind of thing. Yeah. Other thoughts or ideas or questions?
My name is Drew Brooks with Newcastle County, Delaware. About 6 years ago, we scrapped our whole training and started from the ground up. And what we found that worked the most beneficial for us was the hands-on training after our PowerPoint presentation. We had election officers that had been doing it for 15, 20 years that still never knew how to put a curtain on a voting machine. And we found out that helped at the end of the night with the results, make sure they get the right results to the right place, and in turn letting us go home in a decent hour instead of 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Right.
It's great. Good.
And I mean, when you are doing a PowerPoint, and like Mandy said, evaluation of poll workers wasn't very popular, but if you do some kind of hands-on training, you kind of can see, you kind of get to evaluate that way. You know, did they hear any of this? Like, because we're actually doing it now, and I can see if they actually heard it, and they have to put their hands on it, and that makes a huge difference. If you're not going to evaluate your poll workers, you know, that's a way to be able to kind of cross-check that.
In our training, we've changed our training the last 4 years too. We do a 10-minute PowerPoint, and then we divide the people up into their respective groups, and we do individual training for their individual jobs. And we ask our trainers to keep an eye out, and if we are not afraid to reassign people. If there's something that they cannot do or are unable to do, we ask them to please take another job, and we do that quite frequently. And we rely on our trainers a lot to keep an eye out for those folks and help them have a good day.
Yeah. That's great.
So.
That's good. Anything else?
Something that I've always understood when it came to people in general is that there are perhaps maybe 3 different ways that they might be able to learn something. One being by audio, by visual, and the other being kinesthetic or hands-on. Right. And in some cases, some persons are actually a mixture of those items. And so that if you actually go ahead and introduce elements of each within the training, that you should be able to cover all the learning abilities of the people who are involved.
Absolutely. That makes a really big difference. I can say that as a former teacher. That's good. Great. Well, we appreciate all that you all do, I will tell you. We have had a great experience working with election officials in our communities and meeting folks around the country and really understanding how much we all have in common in terms of wanting to make these things work smoothly and well and to make sure that as many people are able to vote as possible. So thank you.
Thank you.